Good morning. What a joyful day to be here, right? This is my best Friday of the week. Professor Merton, good morning.
Good morning.
Welcome to Kuala Lumpur. Welcome to Bank Negara. Welcome to Asia School of Business. Dear colleagues, guests, today it's a special occasion, and Asia School of Business, in collaboration with MIT Sloan and Bank Negara, would like to welcome you to the 4th edition of the MIT Faculty Insights, an event developed and managed by my colleague here, Zalina Jamaluddin, in collaboration with the entire team from Asia School of Business and our colleagues from Bank Negara. For the past 2 months, we had 3 speakers from MIT Sloan: Professor Roberto Fernandez, Professor Roberto Rigobon, today Professor Robert Merton. I think we're running out of Roberts and Robertos from MIT. And we also had a very special colleague yesterday who was a visiting professor at MIT Sloan, Professor Jose Santos, who's in the back, delivered a wonderful session about multinationals and the role of local versus global. And the reason why we have these sessions is to share with you the value of the faculty that we have at MIT Sloan, but also to have them share with you the value of their research in very practical settings. The intention behind Asia School of Business is to build a sustainable bridge between industry and academia through research, through action learning projects, through students who will get to work and run your companies at some point. So Professor Merton here is another example of this partnership between MIT Sloan, Asia School of Business, and Bank Negara. We had over 200 participants in these 3 sessions, and we are really grateful to all of you for joining us. If I look at the number of the people in this room, I would assume that you most know who Professor Merton is, because the free food wasn't that good, so you must be here for him. I spent the past 2 weeks trying to think, what is it that I can tell you about a man who has a bio of 57 pages. At least this is how many I could count. And we all know he's a world-recognized scholar. He's an adored teacher at MIT. We have a few of his students here who are successful today only because of you, Professor, right? So I was trying to find something that I might tell you about him that maybe you don't know. In 1965, there was a book published, On the Shoulders of Giants, Shandian Postscript, by Robert K. Merton, who happens to be the father of our own Professor Merton here in this room. Professor Robert K. Merton is also known as one of the founders of the modern-day sociology. The origin of this book was based on Newton saying that if I have seen farther, it is because I am standing on the shoulder of giants. So our own Professor Merton here grew up standing on the shoulders of 2 giants. His father, who led by example, set standards for extraordinary work ethic, for clarity of thought and expression, and his mother, who told him that first, show them that you can do it their way, so that you want them to let you do your way. Smart woman. So no wonder that our own Professor Merton here can see farther than most people can. He stood as a student on the shoulders of his professors at Columbia, Caltech, MIT, and through intense hard work, he became a giant himself, building his intellectual muscles at MIT and Harvard to only be awarded the absolute recognition, a Nobel Prize. So if there's anything that history can teach us, is that we are nothing without those behind us, and we will be nothing unless we grow to carry others on our shoulders. Ladies and gentlemen, Professor Robert Merton.
Wow, thank you so much. Out of those 57 pages, I'm surprised the ones you picked, but it was very appropriate and actually quite sweet. Thank you. Well, thank you all of you for coming. It's great to be here. I'm going to take my watch off because those of you who were my students know what happens if I don't. We'll still be here this afternoon. So I want to keep track of the time. But anyway, my topic for today, I have slides here. I'm not a slide person. I like to talk to people. So you'll see the slides are not good slides from the point of view if the slides are actually needed for the purpose, because they're too compressed. You know, that you're always told, put one idea, this letters this high, put it on the slide one at a time. You will not see that here. However, the slides do have a purpose, other than my clicking them occasionally. And they are, if you find anything in what I talk about this morning that you find of interest, you can get a copy of them. You can put them up as a PDF. And then the compactness of them you'll actually like, because you don't have to carry something so heavy. But I thought I would tell you that, just so you have a sense of where it is. Now, the topic of my subject, the subject I chose is financial innovation, finance science, in financial stability and economic growth. Obviously, the finance science comes in part because that's what I do, in part because we are an academic institution. And not only that, the bank in its research is also applying the science. So the science is important to integrate and recognize the impact it has had on practice. Now, there's lots of discussions that are going on about the financial system in the press and popular things, particularly since 2008 and 2009. But I just wanted to start out by saying, maybe the obvious, but I would point it out, that the financial system, a well-functioning financial system, is absolutely essential to the growth and economic development of a country. I know you all know that, but sometimes that's forgotten. We all hear about the real sector sometimes, and you know what they call it in China? The fictitious sector. Well, you can see how the translation would go. If you have a real sector and a financial, they're different. If this is real, what must this be? Unreal. What's the synonym for that? Fictitious. So this seeming dichotomy between the real and the fictitious sector, okay, in my judgment, only appears in textbooks, elementary textbooks. In reality, they're inexorably entwined with each other. And though the financial system in many ways is intangible, that doesn't mean it isn't essential. And part of what I want to do this morning on this occasion is to take you through some of the developments that have taken place over the years, but most importantly, to use by example from the past, first from the 1970s, then from the 1990s, and then we'll get to today and into the future. Okay, examples of the importance of what we can do now, what we did do in the past, and to show you that the financial system and financial innovation, which is the way the financial system improves and changes, are big and important. And where I want to end is particularly here, not only in Asia, but in this part of Asia, to say that the financial system and finance science will be can play a very important role in full development, getting the most from the economic potential for growth that the region has. And I'll touch on a little of that at the end. So that's my agenda. Okay? Ready? Okay. So let me get started by talking about, one more thing. When I'm talking about innovation, and I'm talking about the financial system, when you talk to bankers or macroeconomists, rightfully so, they traditionally say what finance is all about is getting savings to investors to get invested for the economy. And that's true. But it's a very, in terms not important, but it's a relatively small part of what the financial system does. The vast bulk of the financial system is devoted to risk. Measuring it, managing, and distributing it in an effective way. Risk is first order in this part of the discipline of economics. And to abstract from it is to miss essentially what much of it is about. Within that, therefore, when we look at the well-functioning financial systems, the markets, the institutions, the derivatives market, which I will use as some examples, is a pure example, a pure system which does nothing but transfer risk. It provides no investment, provides none of that. It doesn't provide governance, nothing. All it does is transfer risk, but it transfers it very efficiently. It does it non-invasively, and it does it in a fashion that if you change your mind, you can reverse it at low cost. And that's going to be very important to understand if we're going to look forward to what we can do. So I will use the examples from the derivatives market. You might guess not what I would choose anyway. I mean, you call a plumber, you're going to get plumbing stories. But the thing is that I want to just really make that clear. So here in Asia, if I look at China, necessarily just sort of sheer size and taking its role, it has a big, big challenge to transform its financial system, not just to be a good financial system for a large country, but to be a world-class one, to be a leader globally. And that's a lot more than getting the RMB to be convertible and a few other things. They need to develop all of that. And that's daunting. And I'll talk a little bit about innovation later, what not to do. But I will say, while it's a daunting task to do that, it's also one that offers enormous opportunities for China. Now, what I say for China applies to Asia in general. Every country in Asia, including here in the ASEAN region, every country can benefit from this. This is where the action is. I've been coming here now for 3 years, almost continuously traveling. This trip, 8 countries, 9 cities. Okay? Because 2 things. One, this is where it's happening. This is where the growth is happening. This is where we can have the impact. The impact on country, impact on region, impact on the world. Okay? And the other is that I found that governments, and those in the private sector as well, but particularly in the governments, are very receptive in the sense that they recognize this needs to be done. It's not a matter of choice for Asia whether they redo all their financial systems. Once you recognize it's not a matter of choice, you have need, then you should not just keep talking about it, do it. Now I'm going to say a few words on some suggestions on how to go about that process, but not tell you what you should do. I mean, I find it kind of a little fun when I come. When you're outside the United States, everybody thinks economist means macroeconomist. So usually when I'm asked to give a talk, I say, what would you like me to talk about? Well, since we're here in Malaysia, I'm not saying this is what was said to me here. I'm giving this as hypothetical. They said to me, well, just tell us what's going to happen to the Malaysian economy over the next year. Now, I think I've been here 4 times. It's lovely. Would you really want to get advice on what you think the future is going to be for this country for someone who's been in the country 4 times, let alone anything else? Indeed, where would I get that advice? Probably ask you, and then I'd do it. So I could get from you and then repeat it to you. So there's a little, it's kind of fun. So I'm not going to tell you here. I hope you hear me in my remarks this morning as a guide. So I see a couple of students there. I always told you, if I ever hear after you left, you go out, you're doing things, that you say something like, you should do this because Professor Merton said so, you're going to be defrocked. I can't take the weight of responsibility of 40-odd years of students all putting it on my shoulders, despite your comments of having things on the shoulders. But really, the point here is to be a guide. What is a guide? I'm just going to show you things. And if the things you see make sense to you, I mean really make sense to you, then you're going to own them. And you're going to agree to think about it or do it because it's yours, not because I told you. And you can have all of the glory because it is yours. I just showed you. But you also have to take all the responsibility. So don't blame me. Okay, so let's get going. So what I wanted to do is to show you the importance of innovation, contrary to some of the popular stories. So let's start in the 1970s. Now, why did I take the 1970s? Well, the 1970s is, in the United States, we had a series of risk shocks that hit the country in the financial system that I don't think you've seen since. And you're probably well aware that most of the comparisons you hear is between 2008 and 2009. They say, worst thing since the Depression. I'm not quite sure why, but I'll leave it up to you to make your own judgment. Why they don't look to the 1970s? Both, it's more closer in time, it had technology. 1930s, there was no infrastructure. I mean, it's a different world completely. 1970s were long ago, but we had a lot of it. But let me just show you first some of what the 1970s were like. And I can see from this audience, most of you were either not here yet or pretty young. So I'm just going to tell you a series of things, no particular order, of the set of shocks that hit the U.S. and beyond. First, the fall of Bretton Woods. We had had fixed currencies for a generation since World War II. And then in the 1970s, suddenly all these currencies are unleashed. These are risks that people hadn't experienced really in dealing with for a generation. That's one. Second one on my list, we had the first oil crisis. Oil went from $2.50 a barrel to $14. Now, we didn't know we had the number, but we had a second one before the end of the decade, and some since. Not bad. What else? The United States was experiencing double-digit inflation. Now, that's an experience that we hadn't had in the U.S. since the Civil War in the 19th century. It is. Not surprisingly, what else did we have? We had double-digit interest rates. Again, not seen in the United States. By the end of the decade, I mean, interest rates, long-term rates are well over 10%. And by the end of the decade, shorter rates actually hit peaks of over 20. This government, U.S. full faith and credit. That's pretty big. Those are pretty big things. And again, not seen. What else do we have? High unemployment. Now, not quite as high as we hit in 2008, 2009, but you're talking about, numbers that are pretty close, 9%. All right? So just imagine, if you will, if the central banks of the world in 2008, 2009 were trying to deal with the crisis we were having. It was a big one. If they're on top of everything else, the high unemployment, the shock, you would have double-digit inflation. What would the policies have been? Do you think Mr. Bernanke and Mr. Draghi, both MIT grads out of MIT? By the way, everybody says University of Chicago is the mantra school. Go and look how many MIT economics and finance Sloan School graduate PhDs have been central bank governors. I mentioned Bernanke, I mentioned Mario Draghi, there was Corbo, there was Rajan in India right now. He's a Sloan graduate. Okay, so there are many. But imagine what you would have done as a policy if you were facing double-digit inflation. The combination of high inflation and high unemployment we call it stagflation. And I asked my macro colleagues if we could deal with stagflation 40 years later if it came back, and they tell me, no, they don't know how to do it. If someone does, you can correct me after the talk or bring it up. But how, the policies that you normally take are pretty difficult to execute. Well, let me continue. The stock market in the United States fell in real terms in 18 months by 50%. Okay? What else went on? We had Regulation Q in the United States. Regulation 2 said banks couldn't pay more than 5%. Now, you don't have to be a rocket scientist to figure out if the full faith and credit from the U.S. government all the way out to the long end, from the short to the long end, is in double digits, and banks are paying a max of 5%, even if they stick some toasters in that they were allowed to do, there's not much money. In fact, there was no money for mortgages. People talk about going back to the good old days when we had control, we understood everything. First of all, I'm trying to get you to see we didn't understand things, we still don't. And secondly, they weren't all that good. Because in fact, no matter what kind of credit you were, you couldn't get a mortgage. So, okay? So that's my list. I'm sure you could add others to it. And as I say, the recessions lasted a bit longer. But what I bring this up for is what happened in the United States after that, or during that and after that. There was an enormous wave of financial innovation. Financial innovation which was responsive to the shocks of risks we hadn't seen before that came in and said, we have to have a way to handle it. People, institutions, companies, and so forth. And so we had created the first options exchange, traded option exchange. What are options? Insurance. They're financial insurance. They're just value insurance, nothing more so. Okay? So we got value insurance. Financial futures were created on those currencies as a result of Bretton Woods, on stocks, on interest rates, on commodities, everything. These came in and developed and managed the risk. We had our first electronic stock market, the NASDAQ. We had various other things, money market funds, which of course Reg Q made possible because they didn't have a ceiling, high yield and other types of bond. Mortgage securitization, well, this is a response. By the end of the 70s into the early 80s, we created a national mortgage market. That transformed how mortgages were financed. It changed the whole industry. But it made the base for funding residential housing in the United States global. Funding was anybody, not just a local thrift institution, which prior to that was the only ones who could do it. Local savings, pretty much. Okay? And then I'll report to you. This is a response to what happened. 40 years later, you can look back, and in the United States, there has never been a time where there's no mortgage money. The rates vary with markets, but there's always mortgage money in the United States. People take that for granted. That wasn't true. That innovation had not only addressed the risk of the time, it's an innovation which has been giving back and helping the U.S. economy and consumers for decades. And there's no reason to think it won't continue to do so with further innovation. We developed the index funds in 1970 in Vanguard. Okay? Those of you who took, the CAPM, it's 50 years old now. Okay? That concept, we transformed how that was done. Paul Sanderson, the famous economist at MIT, he created the department, was on the board of TIAA-CREF, which is, for those who don't know, a very large insurance company that was created to service professors, teachers, research people. It was created in the 1920s, okay, to provide pensions. He pushed hard and had CREF became the first major institution to, as part of its systematic investments, hold global stock portfolio diversification, which we now take for granted. And we go further, we look at Mayday. You know how much institutions dominate the financial system now versus individuals directly buying stocks and taking risks, okay? Mayday, before that, if I bought 100 shares of stock, I would pay a commission. If your institution bought 100,000 shares of stock, you would pay 1,000 times that commission. There were no breaks for commission. They were fixed. It was a cartel. That disappeared and opened the door to the creation of what you see now with the institutions and economizing, they had their advantage. I mean, there's a reason why institutions are driving almost all the investment, direct investments and so forth that are done in markets. That happened then. We created our pension system, ERISA. We eliminated some of the destruction, and there was an enormous amount of finance science. There were students at MIT who graduated in the class of 1972. Now, why I mention them is they graduated a year before the Black-Scholes model, all that stuff was published in the scientific journals. I put that into the class, those who are not probably tuning in here, but I put that into the regular master's course, second term. So if you took finance beyond the first course, you couldn't get around it. I put that, the intertemporal capitalist pricing, I put all of that stuff, and the application of the model to the pricing of the corporate liabilities. Our master's students, this is not about me, it's about the process of being at MIT. Our master's students, not in a special seminar, but as a regular course, were introduced to all of this before it was even published. And there's a long list of MIT grads who've done very well as done well for society as a consequence of being exposed to that, which they could use, which they never would have seen had they, because they graduated before it was even published. Now, I will say, one has to always recognize that it's better to be lucky than smart. When I put that in, I could have put a bunch of stuff in that turned out not to be very valuable to them at all. But so be it. So there was a lot happened. What's the message? The message for here in Asia, where in many countries the development is a bit back, behind. This is the kind of transformation you can do. And this is what can come out of crisis if you manage it well. Because innovation, its implementation, is driven by need, and need. This created need and it happened. And I hope you see it as something that says, hey, does innovation matter? It matters a lot. It's not a sideshow. It's not something that we just don't buy. Okay, so on that I want to jump ahead 20 years into the 1990s and move to Europe. Germany post-reunification. This is a real world, I know it. I really know it. This is a real world case. This is not hypothetical. And post-reunification, as you're well aware, East Germany was not in the same economic mode as West Germany. Okay? And of course, the idea was to try to bring them in there. And the city of Leipzig, which was in East Germany, therefore, what did it want to do? It wanted to grow. And to grow, it needed to expand its electric power. And the way they powered their power plant there was by natural gas. So, as a project for the city, a key project for the growth of the city, was to bring in more natural gas so that they could expand the electrical power and grow. That was their actual situation. The choices they had were Russia, a Russian group offered a deal where they said to them, we'll provide you gas for 15 years at a fixed price of X Deutschmarks, this is pre-Euro, X Deutschmarks per MCF. So, pretty simple contract. You pay X Deutschmarks for your gas for 15 years, no matter what the market is. Okay? To do so, by the way, they would have to build a pipeline from the east into Leipzig that would cost about $300 million. Now, I know that doesn't sound large for a pipeline today. This is 25 years ago. It was not a small number. Okay? If it doesn't impress you, put another zero on it. And you'll see what I'm saying. Okay. So that was one choice. The other was to take their gas from the west, from the North Sea and so forth, and bring it in. But what was the problem? The problem was that if you buy it from the west, you're going to pay the market price. And the market price, I need hardly tell you, of natural gas and every other energy changes a bit. And you got to think of this in the context of a real-world situation that you're actually dealing with, not a hypothetical, not a textbook. Remember, this is a city that came out of a command and control no market system. Not only the people did not expect to see their electrical bills bounce around, but the managers of the city had never had to deal with things like present value or anything like that, market things. You did it. Okay? So to be practical, it had to be simple enough so decisions and things for the city managers and so forth could be made. So that was one of the things you'd have to deal with it. Now, what happened is, a bank, a very well-known bank, got wind of this situation, said, "Is there something we can do about this?" Okay? And the answer was, they said, "Yeah, I think so." And what did they use? They used financial engineering. They used derivatives. What they did is, by using contracts, they come up with another alternative. And first I'll tell you the alternative, what they offered, and then I'll tell you how they did it. What did they do? They went to the city manager and they said, "Here's our deal. 15-year contract. Take your gas from the west. Pay the market price. Anytime you pay a price above X Deutschmarks, we'll refund the difference." Well, it doesn't take rocket science to figure out, which do I want? I always pay X, or I pay no more than X, but I can pay less than X if the market price is lower. Pretty simple. I'd also point out a little thing about this, is not so little, particularly in such projects. It also solved a political problem, potential. What political problem? What if they had done the Russian deal, they're paying X, and market prices for natural gas was a half X, which could happen. We've seen that in oil. How do you explain to your population why the city is paying X Deutschmarks when the market's X over 2? Now, we all understand hedging, but try explaining hedging to a population. By the way, think if you do in the United States, the state of California got into a problem with this electricity, but that's another story. What I'm trying to say is, solution doesn't just include the mechanics, the technical. It has to be designed for the right person. It has to fill the needs. It has to be simple, and it has to take account all aspects to be called a solution. So that's what we did. So now let me tell you how it was done. How it was done was they made this contract. Now this is an obligation of the bank, right? I mean, they took the contract. How does the bank deal with the risk of that? And there are a lot of them. Remember, because they're writing insurance. They're saying any time that the price of gas was higher than this level, they'll rebate the difference for 15 years. That's a big risk. How could they hedge that? How could the bank take on that risk? Well, what did they have to work with? Very little by today's standard. There were crude oil markets for up to 5 years in US dollars, because oil is a dollar market. Okay. Remember, this is a 15-year contract, but they only had 5-year markets. Crude and heating oil basis were swapped. There was no natural gas future, so you couldn't hedge it at natural gas at all. What you had to do is use sort of basis risk between oil and heating oil and nearby products to do it and suffer that risk. There were some swaps available, but only on 2 years. Remember, it's in Deutschmarks, but the oil market's in dollars and the gas market's in dollars from the West. So they had a big FX issue. They had guaranteed that because that's one of the reasons that the price could be higher. Okay, and they had some currency swaps available. And because they put a cap on it, that's insurance. We know they were writing options, and we all know, right? If you went to Sloan, that you know that the option price is not only a function of what happens to the underlying, but how volatility. If volatility changes, that changes the price. So they were exposed to volatility changes in all these markets as well as the levels. And they had crude things to do. But guess what? They put it all together and did it. They even took account, just to show you the detail. There was a 5-year market, so that would say you have to do it at 5 and 10 and 15. So you had three times you would have to do the trade. They figured out, they thought innovation would make it a 10-year market in 5 years. And so they took into account future innovation, markets that did not exist, to say, we actually probably have to do 2, and that factored into the pricing. So I'm just saying, this is a highly detailed thing that requires a high skill set. Complicated? Absolutely. Anything wrong with complication? No, not if it does the job and it's needed. Who should be having complication? Not customers, not clients. Those who are in the business. That's why this bank is in that business. They should be able to deal with complication. That's their job. We don't try to make life simple for producers. We don't ask auto manufacturers, what's easiest for you to do? So they produce a one-door car for us. Okay? So that's what happened here. Now I take you through this because what did it happen? How could the bank give a better deal than the Russians? You know, if you study finance, if there's one thing I could teach children from K through 12 from finance, if I had only one, it's there's no free lunch. And if it's too good to be true, it's probably not true. And if they learn that, they'd stay out of an awful lot of trouble and it would take them through life, and they would avoid a lot of crises. Okay? So you could rightfully say to me, wait a minute, there's got to be something here. How could the bank give a better, banks making profits and so forth. Did the Russians give a high price? And the answer is no, that's not what happened. How could the bank give a better price? Because the Russians had to build a $300 million pipeline. To bring it from the West, you had a little $50 million pipeline. So you had $250 million that if you didn't do the Russian one, you had on the table. And it turned out, roughly, 125 went to the bank, not as profit, but to take all these risks and make it happen and guarantee it. The city got $125 million saving, and that's this deal, which also dealt with some political issues, potentially. Okay? That's not bad, right? Notice the bank didn't do anything physical, didn't do anything in the oil markets and so forth, right? It just used contracts to redistribute. That's what I wanted you to really underscore. But now there's one more piece to this that's very 2015, even though this is 1990s. And what's that? In addition to saving $125 million for society, or particularly for Leipzig, a pipeline, a big, nasty pipeline, wasn't built. That's green. So in this finance example, by using financial instruments to transfer the risk and redistribute things, nothing tangible, but just move the risks around and do it in an effective way, you not only save money, as they made more efficient, but you actually help society in the form of a cleaner environment. And so I use this way. I will mention one other example so you don't think this is the one example that's happened in the last 40 years. In the United States, we have a very large electrical producer distribution system called the TBA, which is roughly a sixth or a seventh of all the electricity in the lower parts of the United States. They put out a deal to anyone who's connected to the grid, so they were really physically able to deliver electricity. They would buy calls and sell puts on electricity, basically sell forward or buy forward electricity from anybody who could deliver to the grid. And they did enough of those contracts. Some of them were very small producers, they call them mom and pop producers of electricity, very little, but they were in the grid from everywhere. They sold enough of those, they did not build 2 nuclear power plants. That's the equivalent of 35 conventional. Again, I'm trying to understand how you see the fact that finance is intangible, it isn't bricks and mortar. Yeah, we have some bank buildings, but that's not what we're talking about. Doesn't mean it isn't part of the real, had real impact. It's just as real as if you had found a technology that avoided, a physical technology to avoid building that pipeline or avoid building those 2 nuclear power plants. So I've taken this time with you this morning as a predicate because I want you to see these examples and understand if you were a part of the process here in Asia of creating your financial system and trying to get the potential out of your economy, you need to build all of this risk transfer facility in. You need to do that because if you don't do it, you will not realize the benefits that you can get, and they're huge. So if I do nothing else, at least call your attention to that. Okay, so that's that one. Now, let's move up to the present. And here I have a list, I have some stuff on the slides here I was going to talk about. We're using financial innovation to address issues. One issue that I've been working on for over a decade now, in terms of implementation, I've been writing on life cycle since my first paper was 1969. But since 2003, I recognize that, nothing deep, that we're going to have a global issue with respect to funding retirement. And secondly, that there are 3 forms of funding: government, employer plans, and family personal saving. that the shock was going to be on top of that, the shock was generally going to be there, that employer plans, the way it was done, was not going to be done anymore. And I'm not going to take you through all of this because I'm going to talk about retirement. But the way it was done before by governments, typically, and large corporations particularly, were defined benefit plans. Those plans became untenable. So it was a shock to the system. Employers were not getting out of providing benefits, but they didn't, the way they were doing it wasn't going to work. It's no different than in an agrarian economy. What's the retirement system? You have a farm, you either have a long-term lease or you own it. You have children, you raise them, then they work the farm with you. And when you get too old to work, you say, hey children, it's your turn. You give the farm to the children, and what do the children do? They look after you the rest of your life. That's a retirement system. It works beautifully until what? The country becomes industrialized, and where do the children go? To the city. It doesn't work anymore. It wasn't a bad system, it just doesn't work in the new environment. Ask a family of my vintage living in Beijing whether their grown-up children working in Shanghai are going to move to Beijing when they no longer need the house. It's not going to happen. So we have to transform things for those reasons. So there's a lot of things going on. All of this came together. And I like to report to you, I worked on, I did the first implementation in the Netherlands in 2005, and so forth. And I won't get into design because we'll be here all morning. But I would just report that why I say I implemented. This exists, that it's a very big challenge, but it's not a science problem, it's an engineering problem. What do I mean by that? The science problem, the way I think of it, is we don't know how to do it. We hope we can figure it out. Cold fusion, solution for energy? Yes, but we don't know if it works. So we don't know. An engineering problem is we know we can do it. It's big, it's complicated, it requires enormous skills like building a complex bridge, but we know how to build it. I will say to you, the global retirement problem, challenge, in my judgment, is an engineering problem. That doesn't mean simple, but it's a whole lot better to know you know how to solve it, even if it's very difficult to do. That's an example, but it's going to take all the innovation that we know how we can do to get this done. So that's an example. I'll just put it up here. Now, let me tell you some of the things that you can do that are important. I'm using examples like I did with Leipzig because I think those you can relate to, and this is not supposed to be a real lecture or I can take notes on how to do it. Okay, so let me give you another example. Typically, when we do policies, regulatory policies, legal policies, objectives, policies that may not even be directly financial, a consequence sometimes of those policies are unintended consequences that are dysfunctional.
These are not here yet.
In medicine, they call it side effects. What is a side effect in medicine? It means you take the medicine to get better, and it makes you sick. Now, ideally, we would like to get the cure and get rid of the side effects. Let me show you how that could be done and was done in the real world, in practice. And here's the situation. Canada. The Canadian pension system for its employees, where this is defined benefit plans, they have money and they invest it on behalf of the employees for their pensions. A law was passed, a rule was passed that said 90% of all the investments made by the pension funds had to be made in Canadian companies. Okay, stocks and bonds. Now, what might have been the motivation for that? Okay, of the government. Why did it get passed? Why did they put the rule in? Well, I know two arguments that were given. I'm not going to say they were good or bad. I'm just going to tell you they were made. One was that if this is for Canadian pension workers, shouldn't we be investing in those companies and industries where those workers are working rather than, investing in other parts of the world where those workers will be fine, but, why should you do that? Now, you understand I'm not endorsing that, but you understand, you probably heard that one. So that was one argument. What was the second one? If everybody followed what the CEPM says, hold the best diversified portfolio, that's the world portfolio, that means you hold all assets in proportion to the amount outstanding in the world. Canada is a big country and a lovely place, but does not have a huge market cap. That is to say, the value of the Canadian industries are a small fraction of the value of the industries of the world. So if you all held a diversified portfolio, as we teach, then Canadians would end up, if they were unconstrained, holding very little Canadian stocks, very little Canadian ownership. And that means what? That the Canadian industries, at least the private sector ones, would all be owned by non-Canadians. Now, I don't know any country, I know my own. I'm not comfortable with the thought that all its industries are controlled by entities outside its purview. So that governance is my point. First was the workers should be benefiting from their own savings, and second is governance. Now, with this blind instrument that was passed, what penalty or what side effect was created? Canadian pensioners, the pension system, were forced to hold a very under-diversified portfolio. And we all know that diversification, which is free, can have an enormous effect on increasing risk return, the payoffs, the returns for a given level of risk. It's one of the great fun things that inventions that we have. It's the basis of much of insurance. Okay? So by passing it for these objectives, it had the side effect of imposing very, very strict non-diversification and therefore a big cost on the entire pension system, including all its participants. What actually happened was pension funds did the rules. They bought all the shares when they were issued, all the bonds, and the Canadian pension funds owned the shares and are under the jurisdiction of the Canadian government. So governance was okay. And all the cash went into these firms. But what did they then do? They entered into a very important but simple kind of contract called a swap. And what they did, and you don't have to be an expert to know, even if you've never heard of it, the contract's very simple. The Canadian pension funds entered in a swap with entities outside of Canada. And they said, we will pay you the total return on Canadian stocks. Whatever they turn out to be, positive or negative, we'll pay that. And you in return will pay me the total return on a diversified world portfolio of all the industries, Asia, Latin America, etc. You understand what the contract said? So no money changed hands. Everybody's keeping their own money. Nobody's doing it. We just signed a contract. And we said, each quarter or whatever, we will look at what happened. We'll look at the return on Canadian stocks. We'll take that return, multiply it by a number, $10 million, $10 billion, whatever it is. And that's money we'll pay to you. In return, we'll look at what the world portfolio did, multiply that by 10 billion, and we'll pay it back, and of course it nets, whichever way. Do you see? Now, do you see what that did? That transformed the risk to the pension fund from being concentrated in Canada to being a globally diversified portfolio. Why? Because they sold off the risk, and they received another risk in return, which is the world. I don't need any slides, I hope to show you. You see what's going on? But what did we achieve with this? We achieved the objectives of the regulation of the rule because all the cash has gone into Canadian companies. That's real. Two, the governance is all under Canadian purview. But we got rid of that really nasty side effect. And I go through this detailed one as an example to say, this is how risk transfer, a well-functioning financial system, was allowing us to implement huge diversification benefits. And they are particularly important for smaller and developing countries who by their nature can't be well diversified. You can see even more. I'm sure many of you have heard the dictum, pursue your comparative advantage, whether it's an individual, an institution, or a country. Do what you're relatively better at. What does that mean? Probably means concentrate in a few things that are probably similar. Very few people have comparative advantages in everything. The fact that you don't. Okay? And yet, what does diversification say? Hold lots of different things that are all unrelated. You see they're in conflict. You see how you could resolve that conflict. We just did it for Canada. Time? But do I sound like my voice is going? Oh, thank you. So one of the things I wanted to show you from that example is how to improve diversification. What else does it show you? It is feasible in size. That's why I gave you these examples. They're real. These are big size, not little experiments. Okay? It's possible to separate the investment, the cash investment. Who puts the investment in? Remember I said the flow of cash from savers to investors. The cash, that's cash. A separate element is the risk. The pension funds provided the cash, but they got rid of all that risk. The pension funds vote the stocks, but they don't take the risk of them. So it is really feasible to separate cash investment, decision where you get it from, governance, and who bears the risk. And this is really a way to transform the world, because we can do this now. And in 5 or 10 years, we're going to do it everywhere. The derivatives markets that I showed you in the 1970s in the United States have grown up in almost every country in the world. They're here in Asia, they're in the UK, they're in Europe, they're in Latin America. So that's at least some evidence that they must have been doing a pretty good thing. I don't think countries are masochists as a group. They don't. The US did it. Maybe it was a bad thing to do, or maybe it was a good thing. But the rest of the countries that followed on the next 30 years doing it, and they've all done it, I like to think that they did it for a good reason. Because they saw the benefits of being able to transform, move risk around. Okay, so these are all different things you can do with it. Now, I wanted to talk about, how much time do I have left here? Oh, we don't have too much. So I wanted to talk about, let me mention one thing local. I'm here in Kuala Lumpur. I was in Bangkok, okay, and Manila. So one of the discussions in Bangkok, and one of the discussions perhaps here, is the idea that to get the different Southeast Asian countries to develop, the degree of sophistication or development of capital markets is different. Thailand, Malaysia, Laos, Cambodia. I mean, you can figure out which countries go with which, okay? Now, all the countries have great growth potential. But if you don't have a financial system that can transform the potential into realization, you actually have to build these things. You have to build them in size to get the benefits of growth. You can't just theorize and say, we have potential, therefore we're done. You actually have to do it. And the capital markets and this risk transfer can do it. So lots of discussion, which I know you know about, more than I do, so I'm not telling you anything, about how can we take some of the countries that have a better developed capital market and allow the less developed countries with less developed market to sort of leverage off that and in some way combine it to get scale, diversification, a larger investment base, investor base. And in doing that, not only provide capital, but much lower costs. Because if you can transfer the risk to the right places, the best places, that's the lowest cost of capital. If you force people who really aren't suitable to take the risk, if you force them to, they do, but you know what? They charge you a big premium. If I don't want to take a risk, and I'm not suited to do it, I'm going to charge you very high prices to force me to. The Canadian example would be an example of that. If you force just the Canadians to hold that risk, the cost of capital they carry is very different than in the diversified world can hold those risks. Because that's what you all learned at school, right? So these are very real. Now, what is the issue here in implementing it? I think all the countries, I'm guessing, you tell me, think this is a good idea in principle. Why hasn't it been done yet? Maybe it is. Maybe it's about to. I hope so. But one reason might be a matter of the countries that are not as well developed might feel a little nervous about transforming, giving essentially the pipes and the control, if you like, in a sense, not literal ownership, of the sources of capital and everything to another country. No disrespect to any of those countries, it's just that they're nervous about that. Countries are that way, and probably rightfully so. I won't give you a solution, but I will tell you One thing that derivatives are really good at, I've said it several times, is transferring risk while leaving governance, cash capital. There's no expropriation risk. If I do a derivative, remember that derivative between Canada and the rest of the world? If the rest of the world doesn't pay Canada, but it owes it, let's say they should, the effect on Canada is they lose let's say 1/4's differential return on their 10 billion. That's tiny credit risk compared to 10 billion that would happen with a cash investment. If I put 10 billion real dollars in a country and they shut it on me, I can lose $10 billion. If I have a risk swap with that country, the most they can take from me is the differential return on $10 billion for 1/4. This will work even in a country with capital controls, not that I'm suggesting they do it. So it's a very different mechanism. And it's one that brings the expropriation. Now, I'm not suggesting expropriation is going to happen in the region. I'm simply saying structurally, you might want to investigate where one way you might practically implement what you're wanting to do, which is not about liquidity. And people often call it liquidity. It's not liquidity, it's risk. Big institutions don't want to get out of your country or a country because they need the cash. They want to get out because they don't want the risk anymore. Try it out. I don't know, I shouldn't say that because my country's likely to be the one that might do it. Guarantee all the the stocks and investment, against loss in some country. The U.S. does that. And see how people feel about having to rush to pull their money out of that country. The capital flows kind of thing. And I think you will discover it's a very different story. Big pension funds and endowments, they don't need cash. Okay? Yeah, they could get somewhere, but typically their investments are much, much bigger than what they have there. So don't confuse capital flows as about cash or liquidity. There are liquidity issues, but I don't think you should confuse liquidity issues with risk issues. And particularly in the kinds of environments we're talking about, risk is often the factor. And you now have tools that you can move the risk without having any cash flow, capital flows, nothing. You see what I'm trying to convey? That's the world that you can move into to do things. I think you might be able to build a bridge using derivatives rather than the actual cash commitments and building solids. And by the way, if you have a swap like I described, let's say you change your mind a month later or a year later or 5 years later, say, that was a bad idea. What do? You just do a swap in the opposite direction and you're out. It's gone. That's non-invasive. It's reversible. Strategies and tools that allow you to reverse things at low cost and not invasive. Notice that in Canada, when they did the swap, it didn't affect the workers, it didn't affect anybody, except through the risk transfer. But you didn't have to reorganize the banks, you didn't have to do anything. You didn't have to change the way people went to work. The day before the swap, the day after the swap, everybody did exactly what they did. That's the nature of when you're only transferring risk. So that's the potential for you there. In kind of wrapping this up to take questions then, I'm going to now take advantage of I've already been doing to you this morning, but I'm going to take advantage to give you my list of some things that I think are kind of important to be looked at. And the first thing I want to talk about, whether it's in crisis or development, you all heard about opaqueness, opacity, and transparency as a way of solving it. And I wanted to point out to you that while transparency sometimes can solve the problems of opacity, in financial services, particularly financial advice, but in most financial services, the rule rather than the exception, they are inherently opaque. Now, what do I mean by inherently opaque? Is banks don't have a choice to be opaque or transparent. Insurance companies don't either. Now, what do you mean by that? Well, let me give you an example from medicine. I wish this on none of you. But suppose you had to have a surgery. Now, that's a pretty big deal, especially if it's an important surgery. And you say, well, how do I pick a surgeon, or how can I have the confidence of the surgeon, and so forth? And suppose you said, well, I want transparency, disclosure. Let's have a complete disclosure. So your surgeon that you're looking at gives you all the scientific studies of the surgery. Every one of them. And we can do that now. You can download it. They're all there. What else do they do? List of all the tools that he or she are going to use. In fact, there's even a list of each step that they plan to do with you. They tell you what hospital, they tell you everything, right? That's full disclosure, that's transparency, right? What's the problem? It isn't transparent to you. Why? Because you can look at all that and you still don't know whether this is a good thing to do, or whether it's a wise thing to do, or they're the best one to do it. That's what I mean by inherently opaque. And I think that financial services, both in terms of importance, which after medicine for working middle class people particularly who are getting these services, okay, it's one of the most important things for them, like medicine. It's inherently opaque. I don't care if we take our MIT colleagues, some of them with 150 IQs, 3 degrees, nanotech, they don't know what to do when they get these things that show the past historical performance on 67 mutual funds in their pension plan. They don't know what to do with it. And they don't know how to analyze it. Is past performance important? Absolutely. Is it any meaningful to our colleagues at MIT? No. It's no more meaningful than all those studies and things that you got for your surgery. They're important, but they're not meaningful. And much of finance has that character. The users, even the wealthiest of people, the most sophisticated people, it's not about education, don't really understand what's there. So what is the substitute you have when you have opacity? You must have trust. And trust has 2 components, in my view. One is trustworthy. You know, that you or whoever's doing this, the surgeon, is doing what's in my best interest. Right? They're trustworthy. Is that good enough for trust? No. I might have a family member who I know loves me and cares about me more than anything. And I'm pretty sure that family member would act in my best interest. But if that family member had to do the surgery, they can mess it up. Probably would, unless they're very exceptional. So you can be buried just as badly by a fool as you can by a knave. So trust involves both coincidence, incentives, but also competence. And we'll go back to the medical example. Don't we all say we're trying to find a doctor we can trust? We're trying to find a hospital we can trust. Well, it isn't that we like. They don't have to like us, and we don't even have to like them. We don't have to invite them to dinner. But we have to believe, we have to have trust in them, because we have no other choice. I'm going wheeled into surgery. What would you think I would say if my surgeon said, Mr. Merton, would you like 12 or 17 sutures? But that's what we do in finance all the time. We ask very intelligent people or very wealthy people, seemingly, you know.
Well, we had a second before the end of the decade.
What do you want? Where the questions are technical ones, not matters of choice or preference. That you should make the decisions. I shouldn't tell you whether to have sports knee surgery or regular knee surgery. There are different risks, different costs, different pain. If you're a jogger who wants to jog till you're 90, maybe you'll choose the sports. If you're someone who's never going to jog, you would never. That choice should be yours. But whether you should have titanium pins in that knee or something else, forget it. Giving you that choice is meaningless. So with this as background, if you look at it from this lens, then we understand that when you have inherent opacity, which you have, and this is why banks and insurance companies are more likely to get into trouble than asset management companies, not because they're somehow less ethical or less moral. That may or may not be true, I don't know, but that's not, you don't need that. Asset management firms tend to be, for what they do, more transparent. You can have more transparency because they're not as opaque. They still are opaque, but not as much so. So they're less likely to have this problem. But when you have a shock where you lose trust in the provider, there is no substitute but trust. That's what I'm trying to tell you. So it has to be replaced with trust. Where do you get that? Sometimes a government steps in when the banks aren't trusted or whatever and says, we'll guarantee all of this. And if you trust the government, in the sense I meant, that both they're going to do the right thing and they're capable, then that can restore it. But what if they don't trust the government? Then it won't work. So what I'm saying to you is, with policies. If you're a policymaker, if you're overseeing, I won't say which countries, if you have rules in markets, derivative markets and others, which are being used and interfaced with the rest of the world so everybody's connected, you better think extremely hard about radically changing those rules in response to a crisis, or what you define as a crisis. The short-termism of doing that has high price. Because once I've been in a market where somebody told me the rules and then kind of basically overnight shuts them down, I'll not be going back to that market again, because now I'm in a frozen market here, and on the other side of the trades with the rest of the world, they're moving around. I'm in a lot of trouble. And restoring trust is a hard task, as we all know, personally, institutionally, and in its countries. So I'm not saying you never do that, but it's a big cost. And I hope this will help you to think about a lot of policies if you treat it from that lens. And now I see I'm really running down. I've mentioned most everything I wanted to. For those in finance, you probably heard Silicon Valley saying, we're going to eat your lunch, we're going to disrupt everything, we're going to, banks, everybody, and, Google's on the world or whatever, but we're going to disrupt you, and, that's a little worrisome if you're in finance. You say, oh my God, they're coming to take, what I do. Well, I'll have this to say to you, and this is related to what I was talking about. Silicon Valley has created some marvelous processes. And if you look at this, PayPal, and you look at all these kinds of things, they're marvelous. They're all processing systems. But think of something like financial advice. What you should do with your money, or what should your return be done with? Someone's giving you advice. Something pretty straightforward and pretty big. Silicon Valley says, we'll send it to you by robo, which means, you have your telephone, and they'll build a really fancy one. I mean, anywhere in the world, it'll flash on and say, here's the situation, here's the thing, and you can change anything you want. And that's wonderful if you're transferring money or something, which is a processing thing. But what's missing? Content. If I send you advice very efficiently, and it's crummy advice, that's really bad. Because not only am I giving you bad advice, I'm giving it to you very efficiently, so you can execute it in full. But I remind you, if you think about this, if you look at what's done there, if I have XYZ Corp, who's going to be writing robo-advice, it sounds good, fast, good cost. How do I know the content's any good? Now, I'll give you an example where you can see it. Netflix. How many people know Netflix? The idea of it, right? Wonderful process. I can go home anytime, click on my internet, bang, up. I can get any movies I want, anytime I want it. I don't, and it's pretty expensive. Suppose you went to Netflix, and it's really cool, right? And you get there, and there's nothing there. Or all bad movies. Well, that's at least transparent, right? You put the movie on, and after about 5 or 10 minutes, you say, this is crummy, and you get rid of it. But suppose it was that way. Then you see pretty soon you're not going to have much use for Netflix, even though it has the fanciest technology in the world. There's no content. What's about financial advice is more insidious, though, because it isn't transparent. When you click on there, you don't see it's a bad movie. You don't know it's a bad movie. And you act on that advice, but it's bad. You see the problem is a different order of magnitude. You do not get that by building a better processor. So if you're in the parts of the business, like Bitcoin has these things, hash function, forget about the currency. That could be a very disruptive technology for clearing and central clearing and settling, which exchanges do. That's real, because that's a processing. By the way, that could be used here in some parts of this world for title for real estate. Everywhere in the world has title insurance when you own real estate because maybe you don't really own it. And if someone's going to lend you on it, they have to believe that you own it. It's bad enough you might not pay them, but if you don't even own it and they lend you the money, you see the problem. So you have title insurance, which can be incredibly expensive. In fact, so expensive you don't do it at all. Right? What if you inserted something like the Bitcoin technology? If you don't know what that is, look it up on somewhere or have someone tell you what it is. What it allows you to do is have selling clarity. It has an entire history of that transaction forever, and forever embedded there. You can't get rid of it. So you see where we are. Take a property. Once it's in there, the process, as it gets transferred, it's always updated forever. And even if a government, not to say they would do this, but hypothetically, even if a government inserted itself to try to fool around with who owned what by changing, I know that doesn't happen, but it's a theoretical thing, just to show you the extreme, right? And they fooled around as to who owned it, it would be there. They couldn't do it without it being recognized, because there's nothing. You can't get rid of it. And it's a complete record. It's forever. Well, that might be a good way to improve real estate ownership and borrowing and funding in parts of the world that have pretty, let's say, less developed or very high-cost title insurance and things like that, or it doesn't have any at all. So that's a good process. That's good. I didn't say Silicon Valley didn't have anything to contribute. But I really want to go back to this because it relates to my trust. The only way you can do robo is if you trust what's coming over, which, remember, the incentive is right, but also the content. And so, if you are in this business and you provide real content, and you structure yourself so that people believe that you're doing what's in their interest, then you don't have to worry about being disintermediated by all this technology. Processing is very competitive. The other isn't. In fact, you'll be leveraged by it, because then I can use the robo for the technical stuff, but it's me who you trust, both in terms of selecting the content and doing what's in your interest. And please think about this, because I know this sounds not like a typical partial differential equation thing that I have, but that's what I wanted to bring out here, because it's going to be very important. And, and I think it's worthwhile pointing it out, because there's so much going on. At least I can point out what I think is not happening or won't happen, and help you to better understand it. Well, I've run on very long, so I think this is a good time to bring it to the end. I had a few other items, but maybe if you invite me back here to the school, this keeps it open, and we can see. You've been very kind sitting there. I know it's much easier for me to stand up here and talk while you all are forced to sit in your chairs, and I appreciate it. But I really hope out of this that what you walk away with is ultimately optimism. Big, big challenges. But these big, big challenges that we see, whether it's in retirement and so many other places, always offer big opportunities. MIT, where I come from, which is associated here, is built around. It's an institute. And if you walk around the big building and look at the words on the top, it says use science, technology, management, etc. For what purpose? To better society, to help improve economies, to do things. That's a little different than a classic university, which is more focused on research, ideas, development, and not particularly focused on how they're used. I'm not saying one's better than the other, they're different. And of course, the universities, nothing's pure, they do that. I think this is what we're trying to exemplify here. That engineers, there's no such thing as there's not a solution. Sometimes it's not pretty, but if you take the philosophy, you're going to do the best that can be done under constraint. And if you take the other philosophy, that you let your mind be completely open. Oh, I have to do one more, sorry. I realized it. If you're going to do your systems here, what's the normal practice? What's the normal practice if you're going to build a financial system or retirement system? You'd organize a group, and the first thing you would say, let's look at best practice, right? They go out, let's record around the world what's best practice. If you remember nothing else from this little bit, best practice is not good enough. Because best practice is the past. By definition, if it exists, it was created in the past. It's a legacy. Now, and particularly those who go back to MIT, you promise you're not going to take, so this is just among us, okay? When I'm in my home state of Massachusetts, and I'm driving on the turnpike, I think of myself as a pretty prudent driver, but I drive pretty fast. Actually, I drive quite fast. So I'm driving on the highway, and I kind of look in the rearview mirror because I want to see if somebody might intervene with my trip. And so I'm driving this way, and I kind of realize I'm driving at over 30 meters a second looking in the rearview mirror. Now, if what's behind me is the same as what's in front of me, that works, right? But if what's in front of me has a turn that wasn't there, it's a disaster. That's my metaphor for best practice. If the world isn't changing, then using the past to tell you what best to do in the future, learn from mistakes, and that's always good, is good enough. But of all the things that we know, first about technology in general, it is changing. I just described for the last hour what that was in the finance area. And finance for sure. And if you're going to go to the trouble, expense, and it is a mess to do, to build a new retirement system, a new financial system, you want it to last. And you don't want to go through that process every 5 years. None of you 10 years ago, or even 15 or more, would not, if you've been called on to go into a country and put in a phone system, you wouldn't have looked at the telephone poles in the United States and said, that's best practice, let's put up the telephone poles. Why? Because you already knew the digital technology was there, and you said, if I was going to build something from scratch, I would never build that, including in the United States. But you're not going to rip the system out completely just to change it, because it doesn't pay. So we keep some blend in the United States because we have a legacy. But if you're going to build it new, so sad, you're going through all the cost and trouble, and you're going to build something that you would never build if you didn't already have it. How do you then look forward? Well, my feature to you, suggestion to you on that is a process, and it's one I've used, but that's not the only one. Instead of looking at best practice, which you're allowed to look at, but put the team together and say, without regard to regulation, without regard to what institutions exist or don't exist, throw all of that out. Clean sheet of paper. The problem is design a retirement system for working middle-class people, blah, 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 okay? That's a problem. You say, what, Sean? Design the best you know how to do in 2015 with everything you know and all the resources you can put together without constraints. Institutional constraints, regulatory constraints, any of those things. Just design it the best way you know how to serve the function for the people who are going to be using it. You see, that's a well-defined problem. I didn't say it was an easy one, but it's well-defined. Take that. Whoever's the decision makers agree. That's the best we know how to do without constraint. What else do we do next? Where are we now in a retirement system? That will be very different typically than this. So two things we now know. Where we are and where Nirvana is. Where we want to be, the best we know how. If you put those two down, you now have defined the strategic process for implementing very large-scale developments like financial systems. Why? You know where you are, you know where you want to get to. So you optimize trying to get there. Now, what goes with this, I have to provide retirement. We have to do it this year, though. We can't just wait, hey, you don't have to do anything until here. So what do we say? We know where we want to be. And we're going to do the best we can to get you there. You are the users, the people, the retirees of the future. We're going to tell you how to, we're going to do the best we can to get you there. And we have to do it with the constraints because there's a regulation that won't let me do it, for example, just to be concrete. And I'm not going to violate the regulation, so I will do it with a constraint. Now, if that regulatory constraint has a big cost, meaning it makes us pretty far away from here, what am I going to do? I'm going to do the best I can, but then what else am I going to do? I'm going to go to the regulators and say, we all want the same thing. This, what's best for people. And if we show them and they say, yeah, that's right, then we say, did you realize that this regulation is impeding that? And my belief is that when they do understand, if they do understand that, and that's all about discussion, they'll change it. Why? Because their goal is to make it good too. Their goal is not to fix. Regulations are not Avogadro's number. They're not a fixed thing. Nor are institutions. Silicon Valley again, remember they're saying the banks, insurance companies, your real competition may be Google. I say, not good enough. Why? Google is an institution. If they start with an assumption it's Google, they've already constrained themselves. The way I'm talking about is no institutional define. Just go and figure out the best way and then design the institution. What kind of institution can best perform getting us to this point? Do you see the process? That is my suggestion as to how to get beyond best practice and to get yourself out of the institutional box. But it's also a very powerful tool for doing things geopolitically, across geopolitical borders. Because while we all have different institutions, cultures, wealths, and needs, the functions for our status of retirement are all the same. We have to fund people's living when they can no longer work. That's universal. It doesn't depend on the culture. How you do it may, but not the thing itself. So it lends itself in this process for creating universal solutions that can work well across borders. And all I can say, that's exactly what I did as a case study, not to say good or bad, in designing a retirement system. And, you know, my suggestion for a retirement solution is to install. It's helpful. And one of the reasons it's helpful, now I'll really close on this, but remember you have this nirvana, where you want to be and everybody's agreed on? What happens is we know you're on your path to getting there. And shock hits the system, 208, 209. Some other shock, political change, some other kinds of things, all the things that hit us. Well, that's metaphorically like you're in a little boat, you're trying to sail somewhere, and a storm comes up and blows you off course. What do you do if you don't have GPS? What would you do if you're blown off course? You look around to try to find what? The North Star, true north. Because if you see new true north, then you know how to reorient yourself to get back where you want to go. This this best solution unconstrained is the North Star of the process. It's where you want to end up. And you know where you are. And if you get blown off course, if you have a North Star, you can get back there efficiently and effectively. If you have no North Star, you don't know where to go. So this I try to put to you may sound highly conceptual, or theoretical. It's very practical, especially for large projects taking many years with lots of complexity. So I'm sorry to take some more of your time on this, but since I opened the can of worms of saying don't do best practice, one more footnote. On the Shoulders of Giants, the book you talked about, if anyone ever sees that book, it's a fun book. Half the book is footnotes, but not legal footnotes that are boring. They're all little side stories. You're reading along, and it says something, 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 and then it says footnote, and you go down, there's a little story. And you as the reader have a choice. Do I want to take a break from the main trip and read this little story? Or no, I don't have time, I'll come back later. So it might say something like footnote. When the soldiers came for Beckett to take him, there was Robert Cannon of Merton, not very big, who attempted to dissuade the soldiers. He was quickly dispatched by the soldiers. That's the end of his story. That was the footnote. So now you found out that little story of Robert Cannon of Merton. If you didn't have time, it was okay. So I'm always doing this. I'm doing this with you. So what I wanted to say to you on all of this is that if you follow this, if you continue this, this is where, I think this is really how you can solve these problems and do them. And it's for real. And as I said, I've done it. And I know one other thing. Remember I told you I was a guide. Long guide. It's a long story. But a guide. I have absolute confidence that when I say something's been done, the only reason I tell you is if you know it's been done, then you know you face an engineering problem, not a science problem, because you know it can be done. I have absolute confidence, whether it's a retirement system or any of the other challenges, figuring out how to get the most resources to all the countries here in the region, you'll do a better job than anything I've described. Partly because what I give you is a legacy, and partly because you know much more about the region, you know much more about it, and you have, frankly, much more resources than I do. So I'm not trying to tell you this is, I've got your answer, do it. I'm trying to show you what can be done. I want to excite you. I want you to feel optimistic about our ability to do these things. Not giddy, these are big challenges, but know that we can do them, but we have to have technology, we have to use all the tools we know how. We can't waste resources, and we can't give up on tools that we've been given that would help us say it's too much trouble, or too hard. Or, I don't understand it, and if I don't understand it, then we can't do it. And if someone says that to you, wherever they are, whether the management of the company, as most senior management, the boards, or if it's the top regulator, they're regulators, and they say, I don't know how to do this, then with all respect to all those people, our collective response should be, you have two choices. Find out how to do it, so you can do your job, or let someone else take over that job who can do it. We can't run our systems, we can't make decisions for our countries of this magnitude in development and have them constrained by who happens to be sitting in the seat saying, I don't understand that. And if you don't understand it, that's your problem. It's not a reason to put the system down or not to proceed. Now, I don't mean proceed when you don't know what's happening. Of course, you have prudence. But those arguments, I would say you should think very hard about not paying any attention to, because they aren't valid, and you will not get there. And ultimately, I believe enough in competition that that one way or another, they're going to be out of there anyway, but maybe at a higher price to society. Thank you very much, and now I really am finished.
Good morning. Thank you very much, Professor Robert Merton, for an extremely enlightening and positive talk today. Well, Malaysia is targeting to achieve high income and developed nation status by 2020, and we're also now a part of the ASEAN Economic Community, which sees a population of over 600 million, more than 60% of which is under the age of 45, combined GDP of over $2 trillion, and projected to rank as the fourth largest economy by 2050. Now, there are opportunities as well as vulnerabilities to the system risk for Malaysia. So, what is your view, and please share with us your pearls of wisdom on how best can our country, Malaysia, move forward, seeing that the majority sectors of our economy is centered on oil and gas, commodities, high-value manufacturing, and services. Our costs in Malaysia is also increasing. So, for financial stability, what, in your view, is the best mechanism to leverage on, for example, risk swapping with other nations similar to the Canadian system? Thank you.
Okay, thank you for the question. That's a nice warm-up question. I always saw the wrong. Well, let me first put in a disclaimer or disclosure that I can give my opinion on a piece of that. I don't know how to do the whole things. I already mentioned I've been here 4 times. I don't have an intimate knowledge of the data or anything else that would need to give any detailed prescription. But I think you framed the question in the context of what I was talking to you about. And I can only reiterate that I think what happens is you need to take the thing, and from the aspect of the risk controls and other things, there's many more parts to this. I've been talking about important, but a piece. Many more things need to be done, but an important piece. And since that's what I think I know about, that's what I'll talk to you about. And what I think you do is you take some kind of approach to it this way and recognize that things that look like big problems now may be temporary. They may be very important, because if you don't survive the day, you can't get to 10 years from now. But while they're important, sometimes immediacy or agitation, or whatever you want to call it, can disproportionately weight towards things that are important but transitory. You need to have everybody says a long-term view. What does that mean? I tried to describe you what I meant. You figure out what you really want. That's the best solution you know how. And then you figure the past, but you always know where you want to go. That's what I think by long-term. You know where you want to be, and then you orient your policies. But as I explained as a practical matter, if I'm doing that for the retirement system, for example, which might be of interest, yes, they're very young. If you think you're young, go to the MENA region. There's some pretty young countries there in terms of the population. But at least some of them realize that if you have 40-something% of your population under 25, or whatever the number is, someday you're going to have that percentage over 65. And so these systems need to be thought about. But come back to the point. You have to be practical, that you've got to be able to provide the services, you have to provide the stability this year, okay? And so you know where you want to get, but then you solve a constraint. But if you have a philosophy, we will do the best for everyone, we know how to do, as a philosophy, within the law, within what's cost-benefit. And that's what we're going to do every time, rather than say, here's a good enough solution, this is the way we're doing it. No, it's a philosophy. It says, we're going to do the best we know how to do, subject to the laws, the constraints, whatever we have, on a cost-benefit basis. And we promise you that if the rules change, if technology changes, we're going to change. Why? Because we're on a trip to this long-term outcome. So it's a way to combine the short-term realities of dealing with crisis or anything else, which sometimes, as we know, can blow you way off course. 1997 in some parts of the world, right? Here. Okay? And they can be big. But this is the only way I have found that I can sort of do it, where people sign into it. Now, if you find a better way to do your North Star, you change what's true north, that's fine. But if you do it right in the first place, you'll find rarely do you have to change that, where you want to go. So that's how you address it. The detail of how you do that requires us to sit down and know a lot more. Anytime, remember, it's too good to be true, it's probably not true. Anyone who tells you the thing you need to do is X and Y, and that's it. People love that. In fact, I always have decision makers say to me, what was the thing that caused the 2008-2009 crisis? As if there was one variable, one thing that explains it all. We love that. We love, great. But that we know, if we really look at it, anything as complex and as big as that had multiple things on it. It's a very complex system. It doesn't mean we can't understand it and do it. It just means those kinds of, sort of simple things. So I will not pretend to say, this is the 5 things you should do, okay? What I will say that you should do is that in this process, to examine rules, regulations, and practices, to keep in mind that it's consistent in the long run, including this issue of trust. Survival is important, so you have to do that. But rarely you have to abandon everything for survival. And therefore, please be serious about it. There's really good solutions, but there's no simple ones. Listen.
Thank you, Prof. Merton, for a very wonderful lecture. Changed a lot of my perceptions on derivatives, and I think the 2 examples you gave were excellent. There's also the use of derivatives for purely speculative means and purely for the purpose of making money, when it's not really about distribution of risk. I'd like to know your view on whether constraints need to be put into place on speculative derivative trading, because I think a number of people have talked about it, including Buffett, saying that this is a nuclear bomb.
Well, okay. The easiest response, since I can say this, because I know Warren Buffett, and that quote, which everybody loves to give, is an out-of-context quote completely, and he will tell you that if you ask him. I won't, if you want to hear a story, I can talk to you afterwards. I won't bore the audience with the details. But I would just remind you, Berkshire, which as you know is run by Mr. Buffett, and he knows every aspect, uses derivatives all the time. During the crisis, he wrote $15 billion worth of over-the-counter puts on various stock markets. Now, if he really believed that all derivatives or these derivatives are basically weapons of mass financial destruction, and he turned around for his shareholders and the world, created $15 billion of these, and that's not the only time. And if you look at it, it's transparent. Would you then maybe ask him that question? It's interesting, no one seems to have. My point is, no, what I'm trying to say to you, he was describing a situation in which he had an insurance company, which had a division, which was in the guarantee business and were guaranteeing up to 50-year derivatives contracts that were never expected to be sold. They were to be held to the end. They were the most illiquid things on the planet as far as financial instruments were concerned. They were to be held in there and they were being compensated for it. He decided he wanted out of that business. From which then, how do you liquidate? And it was extremely painful in cost and time consuming. It's a little bit like if you build an assembly line that's a monolith, one constant, seamless piece, and it's the most efficient, low cost, and then after you build it, someone says, I changed my mind. I want to do it differently. It's ugly. That's why you build things modularly, so you can take pieces out. But if you build a monolith, here, if you build a derivatives book, which is never meant to be sold, and that's why it has value, because someone will hold it that otherwise it wouldn't be doable in say in the market. And you change your mind, it's ugly. It took him a long time, the firm a long time to do it, and they took big losses. And when he wrote to his shareholders, he says, I take responsibility for this. And he said, these things are like, and that's where the quote came from. Now, that has really nothing much to do with the answer to your, real important answer to your question, but I couldn't resist. And by the way, since I've said it publicly, go and ask him, or have someone ask him, and he'll confirm that. And good so, because no one wants to think that Mr. Investor, and I think I lose the word because if someone took it out of context, would make such a strong statement and then turn around and do just the opposite. Do you see what I mean? All right, now let's get back to the derivatives. Absolutely. Can things be misused? They are. Derivatives are the most efficient way of transferring a risk. You saw it. It would transform the whole risk of the Canadian pension system overnight without invading anything. That's a very powerful tool. But it's also a tool that, if it's misused by sheer power, could do damage. It's no different than if you have an innovative high-speed train going 320 kilometers an hour. If it goes off the track, it's going to be much more damaging than if it was going 100 kilometers an hour. But we don't say, therefore, we're not going to allow trains to go over 100, because why? Because we want the benefit of the other 220 kilometer faster speed to get places, and we're willing to take that risk to do it. So anything we do, you all came here today. If you were only worried about your safety, you never would have left your houses. You made a decision, maybe not a wise one, to come and listen to me and take the risks that you did with it. So the idea that all we care about is safety, which often comes up as the theme in crises, is that's not true, individually or collectively. So, of course there could be misuse. And that's why we have regulators, that's why we want to have competent people overlooking. Okay? But if all you're worried about is, we don't want this thing to do any good, so we'll put so many constraints on it can't be used, then you'll never get the benefit that Canada got. You'll never be able to address in an efficient, non-invasive way the challenge of how to put together the different countries in this region who are in this not matched in where they are in development of their financial systems. So, of course, that can happen. And we have all kinds of tools of that. We have the Masters of Finance program at MIT. Now I'm selling. That we created 6 years ago. By the way, we were ranked the best U.S. Program like that. It's not an MBA, it's Masters of Finance, in the United States. We're only number 5 in the world, though. But I'm going to tell you, since you're connected, we're going to be number one. It's just going to take us a little longer. One of the reasons that I was so excited about that program, I put so much into it, and I teach 2 separate courses, 85, 170 students this term, in the term, okay? Because it's a very select program in terms of the quality. At one point, it was the most competitive program to get into in all of MIT, more competitive than Course 6 Computer Science, 16-to-1 applications, and they were good applications. They get a 1-year program, a little longer, and they get trained in theory, empirical work, and practicum. We pick them, they're young, meaning they have very little experience, but they're very well trained in economics, quantitative methods, computer science. We put them all in there, and they go through, those who've been in MIT, you know, at the MIT, 12 months of concentrated effort. They come from all around the world, and we designed it, and I'm very happy to be a part of that, to be focused on outside of the United States. So it's 120 students a year, 100 of them are non-US. What's the idea? Train staff. These people couldn't make decisions. They have no experience. But when they come out, they're really well trained. Trained to not only work in banks and insurance companies and private sector, but work in the official sector, central banks, ministries of finance, sovereign wealth funds, etc. Why? Because you, in your central bank, have to oversee, among other things, these systems which you're talking about, and that now you could have the most visionary person take charge and say, I know what needs to be done. Give the execution to do it, and the staff does not have the skill set to execute, it will not get done, no matter how visionary you are. This program is designed precisely to do that. Build a staff people who can execute. And some of those staff, they're young, in 10 or 15 years, because it's so selective, okay, I'm pretty confident they're going to become decision makers. So eventually we'll affect that. But right now, I'm trying to give you an answer, because one of the things I hate to do is point out a problem without giving you at least a possible solution. So I said to you, remember, best practice is not good enough. That's pointing out a problem. I tried to, with my North Star, explain how you can address that problem. I'm trying to do the same here. I'm saying, yes, of course that can happen. But you can't take the perspective that because that can happen, that's the only thing that matters, and we should shut everything down or impede it, or let's not do it in our place. Do you see? And that, I don't know how else to answer, because that's my answer to you, I think. Yes, sir.
Many thanks for a very insightful presentation, Professor Merton. I wanted to get your views on the importance, benefits, and harms of rescuing financial institutions in times of crisis.
Rescuing them?
Rescuing, yes. Governments rescuing financial institutions. You talked about trust, and you talked about competition and how that creates a discipline for these financial institutions, particularly where they are dealing with very complex products that you described. There is an intrinsic asymmetric information in the transaction where people in the system know a lot more than the clients do. So when there is that level of asymmetric information, trust is very difficult to obtain. And if trust is broken when these financial institutions are rescued, and where the arguments that are provided for the rescue have to do with the general benefits of finance or these products for society, then you have a number of people that become skeptics as to the real benefits. So, what's your view on rescuing financial institutions?
That's a very fair and appropriate question. I am not going to give you a specific statement about policies in China on that, because I don't need to. Because again, as you see, I'd much rather talk about the process, and then let's have the people that really have all the data. If there was anything I want to learn from 208 or 209, is that there were so many people coming out and making statements of what happened and why and what we should do about it. when in fact, when you actually looked at the facts or statements they were making were based on things that weren't factual. So I'm very reluctant to give serious policy prescriptions without knowing all those things. That's a predicate to what I'm about to say. But I absolutely say, first of all, that, that's what I meant by partly China, if it wants to take its role, it's got a big place to go beyond the RMB. And I think the answers are, one, that you don't want to violate the rules, you don't want to be changing the rules radically. We've seen, for right or wrong, again, I don't know enough of what really happened in China, in the stock market in September and so forth, but a lot of rules got changed. Whether that should be done or not, I'll leave that open. But when it was done, there's a pretty big set of changes, pretty quickly. And that's probably better have a darn good reason for it. And the same thing with institutions. When you talk about saving institutions, the time to talk about that is not when it happens. My belief is, if you're the head of, if you're Ben Bernanke and you're told that 2 money market funds are going to break the buck tomorrow, and they're not going to, the companies are not going to make it good, and you think of the dynamic of how people redeem from mutual funds and how messages go out over the internet, at that point you had no choice, in my view, because the penalties to society, to customers of institutions, outweigh penalizing investors from being protected. I'm talking about this issue of bailouts, okay? And my own view there is why that's complicated, is that financial institutions have customers and they have investors. Well, so do car companies. But you really confuse a car company customer with a car company investor. They don't look the same. Maybe the warranty is a little dicey, but for the most part, But in financial firms, if you're an insurance company, you issue bonds. You issue bonds to what I would call investors. Investors defined as that their payoff depends on the fortune of the company. But they also issue annuities to customers. They look technically just like bonds. But those customers do not want what they get to depend on the fortunes of the company. And it's inefficient. It's not about risk aversion. It's inefficient to have contracts like that for customers. And I can be both a customer and investor. It's a role, not a person. And the World Bank could be a customer. You do a very large interest rate swap with a counterparty, which is part of a big structure of you managing your risk. You're very sophisticated. You have huge resources. You want to be a customer. You do not want to have the outcome of that swap depend who your counterparty is. Why? Because it messes up your whole thing. It's inefficient. So this is fast. I'm trying to give you what I'm saying. So the complexity of what you call bailouts, in my view, depend very much on the customer-investor. We don't want to hurt customers, not because they're little or need to be taken care of, but because of the efficiency of the system. So when World Bank is a customer, we don't want you to lose. Lose from what the institution does, not lose on a swap. That's, interest rates go up and down, that's your problem, right? At the same time, we would rather that investors should suffer the losses they're getting, and that's the way to do it. They get intertwined, and even when you create a bank holding companies, we're supposed to keep them apart. It doesn't happen. So my answer to you is, when it's happening, I think that the decisions they make, for the most part, are out of control. I believe, you ask for a judgment and take it as that, most of the time it's already beyond your control. You have no choice, is my belief. It's easy to say don't do it, but when you look at the consequences of it at that point, it's like saying someone's smoking in bed and you say, well, that's something we don't want to do, so let's let the place burn down. We don't do that, even though we say it's going to, you understand those things. Where to do it, though, is when you design the system and you put the things in place and you say, we're going to structure it in such a way so that we aren't put in that situation. We'll try to keep customers and investors apart. And if we can't, then we'll either have to make a decision that says, you know what? Bondholders are with big banks or whatever is your example, or big institutions. If we can't unscramble them, then we better just accept that they're going to be bailed out and they're not going to play a role bearing risk in the system. That's what I would say. What you can't do is what you can't do. So you tell me, you design a real system that will work, do it. It doesn't do any good to pass rules and say we're going to be tough if the structural design won't support it when it happens. And I actually think that's worse. What's worse than being uninsured? Thinking you're insured when you're not. Because if you know you're not insured, you'll take actions if you see problems coming. If you think you're insured, you say, I'm fine, then you find out you don't have insurance. That's what happens to customers, and that's why it's so destructive. They think they have something which they don't have, and they didn't sign up for that risk, but you give it to them. And again, it has nothing to do with whether it's little people or big people or anything like that. So I'm taking the time on this because your question is a very good one, but I think it needs to be unscrambled in various parts. I like competition, especially in finance, and normally you do have that because finance is one of those things that's very hard to get patents under control unless a government gives you a monopoly. So unless we create it, there are very few natural, if any, barriers to entry in finance. And so I'm pretty confident with competition that it will serve. And so I'm generally going to support that as a goal. So that's an aspect of what you were talking about. Okay? And I don't know if this is addressed to you, but I'm trying to be very serious in responding to you rather than, I'm trying to explain how I would think through the process and we could sit down and look at each of the pieces. But do I believe it can be done? Yes. I have one thing, by the way, which I don't understand why in the official sector is such resistance. I think contingent bonds, no fault default, are one relatively simple way to have investors, to cut out the dysfunctional aspects of customers of every time the banks get into trouble, they can't raise equity and so forth. You know what I'm talking about, these bonds. These are bonds that convert into equity, okay, under certain trigger conditions. And while they issue them some places in the world, for some reason, I noticed some theoretical papers about it, but I know how to fix those. We, the field, knows how to fix that. But for some reason, there's a resistance. They somehow say, we've got to go through the bankruptcy process, so we have to have these complex systems of doing it. And yes, there may be aspects of the bankruptcy, but you can do an enormous amount by issuing bonds where everybody understands in advance there's certain things happen, they become equity. And I think of that as no fault default. The decision to liquidate an institution or a firm is an economic decision independent of default or bankruptcy, although they tend to be correlated. So you should separate that. The operations of the system shouldn't be affected by failure to pay on debt to investors. All that does is mess up, redistribute who has the right side of the balance sheet in terms of risk and ownership. Why should that affect whether the bank is billing its customers? Do you see the answer? Anyway, I've gone on too long. I have one thing I'll say with this because you've stayed here. Maybe it'll help ease the pain. I don't know about you, when I hear a song I like, listening to it, and I hear a song I like, the first time I hear it, first of all, I don't like the song, I don't care. If I like the song, first time I hear it, she's singing and it's going, I can't understand one word she's saying. Anyone else had that experience the first time I heard it? Okay, you're good. But guess what? I like the song. So I listened to it 10, 20, 30 times. Guess what? By the 20th or the 30th time, I know all the words she's singing. So for the whole morning with me, if nothing else, if you didn't get all the lyrics, I hope you got the melody. Because that's really what matters this morning. Things can be done. All these questions, I believe all these questions have an answer, but it's not the same answer. It's not this is what we do for everything in every case. Okay? In financial advice, we customize. One size doesn't fit all, You're 34, this is where we should invest your money in for retirement. Think about that. Doing things on average is not so great sometimes. Not good enough. I'm looking around the room. I see some nice shoes, but that's not what I was thinking about. What I see is, I think there's some people in this room who wear a size 6 shoe. And in my looking around, I also see some people who are wearing a size 12 shoe. How would you all like to exchange your shoes for a single size 9? Think of that. That's what it means to give people average, good enough. Now, when it's not technologically possible to do anything but make one size shoe, we'll somehow make them fit. Some will put paper in it, and others will kind of slice the sides to let them breathe so their toes aren't crushed. In finance, there was a time that best you could do was average because you didn't have the technology, the skill, the information set. I can say to you with absolute surety in 2015 today, you can. You can do mass customization in finance, low cost, and you can do it for millions of people. And they don't have to fill out a single form, they don't have to answer a single question because they don't like doing it. And most of the time you're asking them questions that aren't meaningful to them anyway, like how much Thai real estate do you want to have? Do you want a 70-30 or 60-40 asset mix? Or what's your risk-return frontier, where are you on that? And all those things, which is the grass bulk of the question. Are you conservative, aggressive, or normal? And that usually depends on whether you had a good day, whether the markets were up yesterday, whether your spouse or significant other and you had an argument. I mean, there are instance things, but those are examples of things that we don't do. But I would also add to it that we can do customization. So we should customize on everything. Answers for individuals, answers for institutions, answers for how we do your question. It should be customized to China. It should be customized to parts of China. The answer isn't always even the same in every aspect of China. And here in Malaysia, it's a different set of answers. Same principles, one story, but different answers, different size shoes. They're all shoes, okay? And that's what we can do today, in my judgment. And so we ought to do it. Play with everything we have. Don't play with half it tied behind your back. I think we probably exhausted. Can I do one more thing? Okay. Since you're all here, when I ask you to please come up. Well, I have a story that goes with this. I have a small something I wanted to give to the school for having me here. This is my first visit, not my last, I hope, my first. Okay, so the first one, short story. Some of you might even recognize this book. See how thick it is. This is called Continuous Time Finance, and it's somewhere in there. Is almost everything I've said, even now, and I'm just repeating it. But it has about 1,100 equations in it, so it's the best price per equation book in it. So I thought I would contribute to the school here for the MIT and inscribed it, okay? So that's the shorter story. Oh, yes. Well, that's, light reading, The other is this piece of hotel stationery. That hotel stationery. We all stayed in hotels, lived stationery. 18 years ago, when I went to Stockholm, about this time, the prize is always done on December 10th, Nobel's death date. So when I went to take part in the ceremony and receive my Nobel Prize and so forth, and when I was there, I said, there were people in my life, currently and in the past, who had really mattered in terms of where I was. I mean, I really wanted to thank them. You've had some experience. And I wanted to write them, so of course I would do it by hand. And so the normal thing, I'd go out and get a nice piece of stationery or something. And then I had this idea. I said, wait a minute. I'm staying in the Grand Hotel in Stockholm. Now, the Grand Hotel in Stockholm is actually a Grand Hotel. It's right across the water from the palace. But the important thing is, it's the place where all the laureates stay every year since the founding of the Nobel Prizes. You always stay there. 2 movies made about it. One with Paul Newman, and if you don't remember him, probably some of the women remember him. Anyway, so there's 2 movies about it. So the Grand Hotel in Stockholm is an icon. It's one of the icons of the whole process. So I said, what better way to write a really intimate and focused thank you for why I was there than on their own stationery. And I asked the management, would you provide me with some stationery? And they did. And after I wrote all those letters, I found out I had some left over. So for the last 18 years, I've kept these for special occasions, in my view. Again, this is personal. Where now we come to it here, I've given this to you, and it says, it's on the Grand Hotel, Stockholm, and it says, for the Asian School of Business, I have the option pricing formula, I find it, Nobel Week, etc. So I know it's a piece of stationery, but this is my way of saying that thank you for this very special thing, and to say thank you to all.
None of us have a Nobel Prize or a memory from such a special moment. We're still building this school, and we are building the school on the shoulders of many, many more who came before us. So this is.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very, very much. Well, thank you very much. And thank you again for your patience and your fortitude. One of the things I enjoy about Asia is meetings actually get scheduled for talks for 90 minutes or even 2 hours. You couldn't do more than 45 minutes in the United States. People wouldn't sit in their chairs. So I don't know what to draw from all of that. I'll let you draw your own inference. But thank you all very much for staying, listening, and being such a good audience. Thank you.